Before we speak of what humanity became, we must speak of what the galaxy was, not as it imagined itself to be, orderly, enlightened, eternal, but as it actually was. Because understanding what they built requires understanding what they tore down first, and what they tore down was, in many respects, themselves. In the year 2847 of the Common Galactic Reckoning, what humans in their own calendar called the late 23rd century, the Interstellar Concordat was the dominant governing body of the known galaxy. 17 species, 412 inhabited systems. A peacekeeping force called the Pale Veil, named after the bioluminescent membrane of the Orathi elder caste, which was, in all its self-congratulation, about as effective at keeping peace as a membrane is at stopping a blade. Humanity had joined the Concordat in CGR 2801, 46 years before the events we are about to describe. They had been admitted not with celebration, but with the cautious, slightly annoyed tolerance of a long-established club whose members are forced by their own charter to accept a new applicant. Humans were, in the polite language of the Concordat archives, provisional members of the third tier. In the impolite language of every council session where they were discussed, they were the short-lived ones, the impulsive bipeds, the species who had somehow crammed 3 of their major world wars into the same century and still managed to reach the stars. This was not entirely unfair, but it was, as we shall see, a catastrophic misreading. The Concordat's power structure in CGR 2847 was dominated by 3 species: the Orathi, ancient and philosophical, who had held a seat on the executive triad for 6,000 years; the Keth-Saron, industrial giants whose mining fleets stripped entire asteroid belts and who financed 40% of Pale Veil operations; and the Velmari, an aquatic species whose communication network spanned 90% of known space, making them, in practical terms, the nervous system through which all Concordat information flowed. Humanity held no seat on the executive triad. Humanity controlled no significant communication networks. Humanity's fleet, the Terran Expeditionary Assembly, or T, comprised 63 warships, most of them aging vessels retrofitted with Concordat standard drives. They were, in the view of most Concordat military analysts, a rounding error. And then came the Moor. The Moor are not a species in any biological sense we have words for. They are, and the historical record on this remains genuinely contested, either a collective intelligence distributed across the dark matter lattice between star systems, or they are something so far beyond our categories of understanding that calling them a species is simply the best approximation we have. What is not contested is what they did. In CGR 2843, the Moor deployed what would come to be known in every historical archive in the galaxy as the Severance. The Severance was a weapon, or it behaved as one. It operated on a principle that 37 species have since attempted to understand, and which precisely 2 have successfully reverse-engineered. It destabilized the coherence field of any sufficiently complex neural network, biological, computational, or hybrid, within a radius determined by the weapon's calibration. At minimum setting, it killed every sentient being in a star system within 48 hours. At maximum, the effective radius extended across 11 light-years. No species who faced the Severance had ever survived it. Not one. The Moor had used it 12 times in the previous 4,000 years, against civilizations the rest of the galaxy had simply never heard of, or had written off as colony losses. When the Concordat's historians finally correlated the data, after the fact, always after the fact, they found 12 distinct absent signatures in the galactic census, regions where spacefaring civilizations had existed and then simply stopped. Planets still intact, infrastructure still standing, no bodies because there were no bodies, only the terrible quiet of dead neural tissue in every living thing for 100 million square kilometers. In CGR 2847, the Moor turned the Severance toward the Concordat. The Orathi High Chorus, their governing body, received the first warning from deep-range sensors 17 days before the weapon fired. What they did with those 17 days is a matter of significant historical controversy. The executive triad convened 4 emergency sessions. 18 proposals were debated. 3 were passed. None of them were the right ones. What they did not do in those 17 days was warn humanity. This was not an accident. Excerpt from the classified communication, CGR 2847, Day 4 of the Triad Emergency Session, recovered from the Orathi Deep Archive by the Remembrance Institute, CGR 3901. The Terran Expeditionary Assembly has been reviewed and assessed as strategically non-contributory to the proposed response. Additionally, including humanity in the briefing carries significant risk of unauthorized disclosure and destabilization of the evacuation priority matrix. The Triad recommends that Earth and its colonies be classified as Tier 4, non-essential, for the purposes of this emergency. Signed, First Speaker Uvareth Nim, Orathi High Chorus, on behalf of the Executive Triad. Tier 4, non-essential. That is what they called them. That phrase, in its original Orathi, Sev Kai Drathan, meaning roughly, outside the weight of consideration, would, 4 centuries later, be carved into the base of a monument on a world that did not yet exist when those words were written. The Severance fired on the 17th day. The Moor, with what can only be described as contemptuous efficiency, targeted the highest population centers of the Concordat's first and second tiers first. The Orathi homeworld, the Keth-Saron Central Hive Cluster, 12 Velmari communication relay stations, each one a nexus of billions of data streams and thousands of living operators. The Concordat evacuation, such as it was, managed to move approximately 3.4 billion people from the targeted zones before the weapon discharged. In a Concordat of roughly 400 trillion sentient beings, this was not even a rounding error. It was less than nothing. Earth and its colonies were not targeted in the first discharge, not because the Moor did not intend to reach them, but because humanity, small, irrelevant Tier 4 humanity, was simply not yet worth calibrating for. They were scheduled. That is the word the Concordats recovered Moor interaction data uses. Scheduled. And so, in the chaos of the first Severance discharge, humanity received the news the same way the rest of the surviving galaxy did. Through fragmented, terrified Velmari network bursts, through the testimony of Keth-Saron freighter pilots who had been in deep space when the weapon fired, through the eerie silence of communication channels that had, until 17 days ago, carried the unbroken chatter of 400 years of galactic civilization. Humanity's response in those first 72 hours was, and here the historian must be precise, not panic. The records are clear. There was shock. There was grief. There was, in many documented cases, a kind of cold and terrible clarity. Director General Amara Osaibansu, head of the Terran Expeditionary Assembly, was aboard T flagship Meridian when the first confirmed reports arrived. Her personal log from that period survives. Personal log, Director General Amara Osaibansu, T flagship Meridian, CGR 2847, Day 22. We have confirmation now. The Orathi homeworld is silent. The Keth-Saron cluster is silent. Velmari relay networks 4, 7, 11, and 13 are gone. We were not warned. I want to write that again so I do not let myself soften it in the weeks ahead. We were not warned. The Concordat looked at us and decided we did not matter enough to tell. I have been sitting with that for 6 hours. I have decided something. Whatever we do next, however long it takes, however much it costs, we will never again be the species that gets left off the list. We will never again be Tier 4. Not because I am angry. I'm past angry. But because the galaxy has just shown us something true about itself, and the only honest response to a true thing is to act on it. Whatever we do next, however long it takes. She could not have known in that moment what those words would mean. No one could have. The people of CGR 2847 did not know they were standing at the beginning of the most consequential 4 centuries in galactic history. They thought they were at the end of something. They were, in the way of all people who survive catastrophe, simply trying to understand what remained. What remained was this: humanity, intact and unwarned, in possession of 63 aging warships and a civilization that had been, until now, considered too small to bother with. The Moor had scheduled them. The Concordat had written them off. The galaxy had looked at humanity and calculated, quite calmly, that they were not worth the effort of consideration. That was the mistake. That was the mistake that echoes through everything that follows. On day 28 after the first severance discharge, a T long-range sensor probe, originally deployed to study a nebula formation in what was called the Dresch corridor, picked up an anomaly. It was not a natural phenomenon. It was a fragment, roughly 38 cubic meters of superheated material, drifting in the debris field left by the destruction of Keth-Saron Relay Platform 7. The probe's automated systems flagged it because of an unusual energy signature. Not dangerous. Not significant, just unusual. The probe's data packet reached T-Command 41 days later. A young sensor analyst named Ren Vasquez. Aikta, 24 years old, working a double shift because half his colleagues had been reassigned to refugee coordination, opened the packet. He looked at the energy signature. He looked at it for a long time. Then he wrote 3 words in his analysis log and forwarded it, marked urgent, to the T-Science Directorate. The 3 words were, "This is it." He was right. The fragment was a piece of the severance delivery mechanism, a shard of the weapon itself, thrown free by the destruction of the relay platform. Damaged, incomplete, but real. For the first time in the documented history of the galaxy, a piece of the severance existed somewhere other than in Moor control. And it existed in human hands. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something, then hit that like button right now. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it today. Hit subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss another story like this one. What happened next is not, strictly speaking, a secret. The records exist. The documents survive. The names of the people who did this work are known. But for 400 years, no one outside of humanity's inner scientific councils knew it was happening. And that sustained, disciplined, multi-generational silence is perhaps the most remarkable thing about this entire story. Let us be precise about the timeline, because the timeline is everything. The fragment arrived at T Research Station Helix 7, a facility orbiting Europa, in CGR 2848. The initial analysis team was 7 people. Within 6 months, that team had grown to 43. Within 2 years, it was 400. The project was classified above top secret, a classification level that, in humanity's governmental structure, required the personal authorization of the Director General and was reviewed every 90 days. Every 90 days, for the next 231 years, that classification was renewed. They called the project internally Cartographer, because, as the project's first chief scientist, Dr. Yuki Tanaka Osai, no relation to Director General Osabansu, though they would later correspond at length, explained to her team on the project's first official day. We are not trying to build a weapon. We are trying to make a map of how this thing works at every level, in every dimension we have the instruments to measure. A map so complete that, when we are done, we will know it better than the people who built it. This was not bravado, it was a research philosophy, and it was correct. The fragment was, at the molecular level, made of materials that did not exist in known chemistry. Not exotic, unknown. The first 5 years of Project Cartographer were spent simply cataloging what they were looking at. Dr. Tanaka Osai's published papers from this period, published under pseudonyms in obscure xenomaterial journals, each one a carefully constructed fragment of information that revealed nothing of the whole, are now considered foundational texts in fields that did not exist when she wrote them. Meanwhile, the galaxy was reorganizing itself around the wound the Moor had opened. The surviving Concordat species, approximately 60% of member civilizations, had suffered significant losses. 8 had been effectively destroyed, spent the decade after the first severance discharge doing what bureaucracies always do after catastrophe. They held meetings. They formed committees. They drafted frameworks. The new Concordat Compact of CGR 2851 established a Moor Defense Initiative, funded at 40% of combined member GDP, focused on, and here the historian must exercise restraint, defensive shielding. The theory being that if you could shield your planets against the severance's coherence field disruption, you could survive the weapon. This was not wrong. It was simply inadequate. A shield that lets you survive the weapon does not stop the weapon from firing. And the Moor, as events would demonstrate, had patience measured in geological time. Humanity participated in the new Concordat Compact. Humanity contributed researchers to the Moor Defense Initiative. Humanity's delegates attended every session of the reformed Executive Council, now expanded to 9 seats, with humanity still holding none of them, and spoke, and were listened to with the same polite insufficiency that had always characterized their treatment, and returned home, and continued, quietly and without announcement, the work that no one else was doing. There is a letter, private correspondence, never intended for any archive, from Dr. Tanaka Osai to her daughter, written in CGR 2861, 14 years into the project. Her daughter had just been accepted to the University of Nairobi's Xenophysics program and had written to her mother asking for advice. Personal letter, Dr. Yuki Tanaka Osai to Dr. Student Hana Tanaka Osai, CGR 2861, recovered from the Tana Kaosai Family Archive by the Remembrance Institute. You ask me what I think you should study. I will tell you what I tell everyone on my team, though I have never written it down before. Study what breaks things. Not just what things are made of, that is chemistry. Study what breaks them. Because the universe at every level is held together by coherence, by things fitting together in ways that make larger things possible. And the only way to understand how coherence works, truly understand it, is to understand precisely how it fails. Your grandmother asked me last week why I have spent my life on a project I cannot tell her about. I told her I was making a map. She asked me of what. I said, of what holds us together. That is not entirely false. What holds us together? 14 years in, she was beginning to understand the severance not as a weapon in the conventional sense, but as a coherence disruptor, something that targeted not matter or energy directly, but the organizing principle that allowed matter and energy to form the complex patterns that constituted life and intelligence. It was, in a sense, a weapon that killed the idea of organization itself. Understanding that was the first breakthrough. The second breakthrough, which would not come until CGR 2891, 44 years after the fragment arrived, was understanding how it was aimed. The Moor did not target planets. They targeted coherence signatures. Every sufficiently complex neural network, biological, artificial, or hybrid, produces what the cartographer team called a coherence resonance signature, a distinctive pattern in the quantum substrate of local spacetime. The severance identified these signatures, locked onto them, and then, and this is the part that took 30 years to understand, it didn't disrupt the signatures. It inverted them. It turned the organizing principle of a mind against itself. A coherence field, inverted, becomes a dissonance field. A dissonance field, applied to a neural network, produces rapid and total cascade failure. In 87% of documented cases, death occurred within 6 hours. In the remaining 13%, the ones the Moor apparently considered an acceptable margin of incompleteness, within 48. When the team finally understood this, there was, according to 3 separate personal accounts from team members present that day, a very long silence in the main research bay of Helix 7. Then Dr. Tanaka Osa, who was 71 years old by then and who had spent 44 years of her life on this problem, said something that has since been quoted in every account of this moment. She said, "All right, now we know what it does. Now we learn how to do it ourselves." She would not live to see the project completed. She died in CGR 2904 at the age of 83 in her lab on Helix 7 with her colleagues around her, and an equation she had not quite finished on her whiteboard. Her daughter, Dr. Hana Tanaka-Ose, now herself a leading xenophysicist, recruited to Project Cartographer 18 years earlier, completed the equation 2 weeks later. She had it framed. It hangs today in the Tanaka-Osai Institute on New Geneva and is considered one of the most significant pieces of mathematics in galactic history. The work continued. The second generation of cartographer researchers were, in many cases, the children of the first. The third generation were the children of the second. This was not coincidence. The project's security protocols required that every member undergo a 17-year clearance process, which meant, practically speaking, that you either recruited within families already cleared, or you waited 17 years for each new member. The Cartographer Project became, in a very real sense, a dynasty. Families who committed to it committed across generations. Children grew up knowing that their parents worked on something important and secret, and knowing that they, too, would be asked if they wanted to carry it forward. Most of them said yes. There was, during these years, one significant external incident. In CGR 2919, 72 years into the project, a Velmarie intelligence analyst named S. Seth Vara, working for the new Concordat's Information Sharing Bureau, noticed something. Specifically, she noticed that humanity's published output in xenomaterial physics, while consistent across 7 decades, had a structural characteristic she found unusual. It was always partial. Every paper from any human institution that touched on topics adjacent to coherence field theory contained, she documented this, exactly the information needed to understand a concept up to the point of a specific type of synthesis. And then it stopped. Not because the researchers had run out of ideas. The papers were too good for that. They stopped because they were choosing to stop. Internal report, Velmarie Intelligence Bureau, Analyst S. Seth Vara, CGR 2919, classified signal. Blue, recovered from the new Concordat archive by the Remembrance Institute, CGR 3412. Recommend elevated monitoring of Terran research institutions, specifically those with xenomaterial physics programs. Pattern analysis of published output over a 72-year period suggests coordinated information management, not suppression, but strategic partial disclosure. The aggregate of human publications in relevant fields is consistent with a research program of significant scope, maintaining deliberate opacity regarding synthesis-level conclusions. It is my assessment that humanity may be engaged in a long-term parallel research effort on Moore-adjacent technology. This assessment is based on pattern recognition alone and may be incorrect. I request authorization for deeper analysis and resource allocation. Analyst S. Seth Vara. Authorization request. DENIED by Chief Coordinator Pelnathuvu on grounds of insufficient evidence and resource constraints. S. Seth Vara resubmitted her request 4 times over the following 12 years. Each time, it was denied. The chief coordinator's reasoning was, by Velmarie bureaucratic standards, impeccable. The Moore Defense Initiative was consuming the majority of available intelligence resources. The human pattern she had identified was ambiguous, and allocating significant monitoring resources to a Tier 3 species, humanity had been promoted, but not by much based on statistical analysis of academic publications was, in the coordinator's assessment, disproportionate to the demonstrated risk. S. Seth Vara retired in CGR 2938. She is recorded as having said, at her retirement gathering, that she was looking forward to not worrying about things she could not convince anyone else to worry about. The historical record does not preserve her expression when she said it, but one of her colleagues noted, in a private memoir published after the return, that she had not looked like someone at peace. The project crossed a threshold in CGR 2997, 150 years after the fragment's arrival, when the third-generation cartographer team, now operating from 3 facilities across the solar system and 2 stations in the outer Terran colonies, successfully generated, for the first time, a coherence resonance signature in a controlled laboratory environment. This was not yet a weapon. It was barely even an experiment. It was a proof of concept. They could now produce, artificially, the foundational phenomenon that the severance exploited. They understood it well enough to make it. The Director General at the time, the Office of Director General of the T had, by this point, evolved into something considerably more powerful than its original mandate, was a woman named Juno Reyes Nakamura. She received the report from the cartographer team on a Thursday morning, and according to her executive assistant's records, canceled every meeting for the rest of the week. On Friday, she traveled personally to Helix 7, now expanded to a station with a crew of over 2,000, and met with the project leads. What was said in that meeting was not recorded, but the project's funding allocation the following month increased by 800%. They were not building a weapon yet. They were still making the map, but the map was nearly complete. 107 years later, in CGR 3104, the map was finished. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something, then hit that like button right now. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it today. Hit subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss another story like this one. What the galaxy saw, on the morning of the 14th of Reckon Month 7, CGR 3108, 4 years after the map was completed, and 261 years after Ren Vasquez Icta opened a data packet and wrote 3 words in his analysis log, was a ship. Not a fleet, one ship, emerging from a fold transit point 30 light towers outside the new Concordat's primary assembly station, the Oreth Nexus. The ship was human-built, but it was not any human-built ship that any Concordat database had a record of. It was 11 kilometers long. Its energy signature was, and the Oreth Nexus sensor operators who filed their reports that day used this word repeatedly as if no other would serve wrong. Not dangerous wrong, not hostile wrong. Just wrong. As if the ship was operating on principles that the sensors understood individually, but could not reconcile as a coherent whole. The ship broadcast on all standard Concordat frequencies. The message was brief. It said, in 6 Concordat languages simultaneously, "This is the T vessel persistence. We are requesting a session of the Executive Council. We have information relevant to the Moore situation. We ask for 72 hours of your time." The Moore situation. As if 261 years of galactic paralysis could be summary. Said so casually. There was a trader in the shipping lanes that morning. His name was Greton, a Keth-Saron independent hauler running a cargo of processed rare earth minerals from the Dresh corridor to Oreth Nexus station. He was close enough to the fold transit point that his sensors picked up the persistence before the station's formal alert systems had finished initializing. He later gave testimony to a Remembrance Institute interviewer, nearly 40 years after the event, in which he described what he saw. Oral testimony of Greton, independent trader, recorded by the Galactic Remembrance Institute, CGR 3147. I had seen human ships before. Everyone had. Little things fast, well-built, but nothing you would look at twice. This was not that. I was running passive sensors, quiet approach to a busy lane, standard practice, and my system flagged an anomaly and I looked at my display and I just stopped. I stopped everything. I stopped my intake of breath, because the thing on my display was not possible, not by anything I knew. It was too large for the engine profile it was showing. It was too quiet for its apparent output. It was like watching someone lift something they could not possibly lift and doing it slowly, like they were not even trying. And then the broadcast came through, and I heard the word persistence, and I thought, that is a very human name for a ship. And then I thought about why they might have named it that, and I started to be afraid. Not of the ship, of what the name meant, of how long they had been patient. The Executive Council convened an emergency session within 4 hours. The humanity of this moment is worth dwelling on, because the Council's response tells us a great deal about how completely they had miscalculated. Their first instinct, documented in the session records, was to ask if humanity had violated the new Concordat's weapons development protocols. Their second instinct was to ask what humanity wanted. Their third instinct, and this one, at least, was correct, was to wonder how they had built something that large without anyone noticing. The answer to the third question was straightforward. Because for 260 years, the Concordat's intelligence apparatus had been pointed at the Moor, not at a species it had categorized as Tier 3 and forgotten to upgrade. The Persistence's captain was a man named Admiral Kofi Asant-Mensah, fourth-generation cartographer family, grandson of 2 of the project's second-generation leads. He was 62 years old. He had been in space, with brief exceptions, for 31 of those years. He met with the Executive Council, now 14 seats, still no human seat, in the Orath Nexus primary chamber, in person, without an honor guard, wearing a uniform that no Concordat database had a classification for, carrying nothing that any sensor array could identify as a weapon. He was, by every account of every delegate who was present in that chamber, absolutely calm. He told them in a presentation that lasted 4 hours and 22 minutes what Project Cartographer had been, what they had found, what they had built. He did not soften it. He did not contextualize it with diplomatic language. He explained that humanity had, over the course of 261 years, achieved complete technical comprehension of the severance, including its fundamental operating principles, its delivery mechanism, its coherence targeting system, and its calibration architecture. He explained that humanity had, in the past 4 years, built 3 devices based on this comprehension. The chamber was very quiet. He then said something that, depending on the account you read, was either the most terrifying thing any council delegate had ever heard, or the most relieving. He said, "We are not here to use them. We are here because the Moor have just targeted 4 Concordat systems for the next discharge cycle, and we intercepted their targeting data 6 months ago, and we have a proposal." The Moor's next discharge had been scheduled, that word again, for CGR 3109, 14 months away. What followed the council session was not, in the immediate term, the galaxy's finest hour. The 14 months between Admiral Asant-Mensah's presentation and the scheduled discharge were characterized by 3 separate Concordat legal challenges to the legitimacy of Project Cartographer under the new Compact's weapons research clauses, 2 attempts by council members to seize the technical documentation by claiming it was Concordat intellectual property under the shared research provisions of CGR 2851 treaty. 1 serious diplomatic incident when a Velmarie fleet was dispatched to the Persistence's location, and the ship, without any apparent effort or hostility, simply moved to a position that made the fleet's tactical posture irrelevant, and 1 emergency session in which 11 of the 14 council delegates agreed that humanity was, in fact, in violation of various protocols, and 3 delegates, the 3 from species that had suffered the most losses in the original severance discharge, said, in terms that the diplomatic record describes as blunt, that they did not particularly care. Admiral Asant-Mensah, during this period, attended every council session he was invited to, and several he was not, and remained, by every account, absolutely calm. Privately, in correspondence with Director General Amara Osaibansu IV, great-great-granddaughter of the woman who had written, "We will never again be Tier 4, in her log 260 years earlier, he was somewhat less measured. Encrypted message, Admiral Kofi Asantmensa to Director General Amara Osaibansu IV, CGR 3108, Day 214, recovered from the T-Command archive. They are arguing about paperwork. 14 months until the discharge, and they are arguing about whether cartographer violated a treaty clause from 250 years ago. I want to tell them that their civilization almost ended and we spent 2.5 centuries making sure it would not happen again, and their response is to form a subcommittee on intellectual property. I will not tell them this. I will be patient. I have been trained to be patient. The entire point of what we are is patience, but I want you to know that I am thinking it very loudly." He was patient. The proposal was eventually, 61 days before the scheduled discharge, accepted, conditionally, with 17 attached provisions, 4 review clauses, and a sunset framework that would have required reauthorization in 10 years. None of that mattered. What mattered happened on the 14th of Reckoning Month 3, CGR 3109. The Moor fired the severance. This was confirmed by 37 independent sensor arrays across Concordat space. The discharge signature was unmistakable, the distinctive quantum substrate distortion pattern that every surviving civilization's sensor network had been calibrated to detect for over 2 centuries. It fired at the 4 targeted systems. The targeting was, as always, precisely calibrated. The coherence-dissonance wave expanded outward at its standard propagation rate. And then, 11 seconds into propagation, it stopped. Not deflected, not absorbed, stopped. The coherence-dissonance wave, a phenomenon that no sensor system had ever recorded behaving in any way other than inexorable expansion, ceased to propagate. Its energy signature did not dissipate. It inverted. The weapon fired back along its own targeting path, guided by the coherence-resonance lock that the Persistence's devices had placed on the Moor's own firing signature. What happened to the Moor at the other end of that inversion is not fully documented. The Moor are not a species that leaves bodies. They leave silences. The silence on the Moor's distributed frequency, the quantum substrate hum that had been detectable, if you knew what to listen for 4,000 years, lasted for 6 days. Then it resumed, much quieter, in a much smaller region of space. The galaxy did not immediately understand what had happened. The first reports reaching Oreth Nexus Station described a severance malfunction, then a Concordat sensor anomaly. Then, as more data arrived and more analysts looked at it, a growing and disorienting recognition that something had happened that did not fit any existing category. A military commander named Fleet Admiral Ehsan Vori, commanding the Concordat's newly assembled Moor response fleet, 38 warships, the largest military formation the reformed Concordat had managed, was receiving data from his sensor officers in real time. His bridge log records what his senior communications officer said to him at the moment the implications became clear. She said, "Admiral, the humans did it." His log records a silence. Then, "Did they warn the Moor?" Another silence. Then, "No, sir, they did not." The Concordat Council chamber erupted. The historical record uses that word, erupted. Species who had not been in physical proximity to each other in decades were suddenly pressing against each other's delegates, demanding answers, demanding explanations, demanding to know how, demanding to know why they had not been told more, demanding to know what had been built and where and when. It was, by every account, extraordinarily loud. Admiral Asantmensa stood at the front of the chamber and waited for the noise to reduce to a level where he could be heard. It took 11 minutes. When it did, he said 4 words. "We are not done." If this story moved you, if it made you feel something, then hit that like button right now. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it today. Hit subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss another story like this one. What the galaxy became, in the centuries after CGR 3109, is what we are. It is this archive and this institute, and the Unified Galactic Remembrance Compact, and the four-species executive triad in which humanity has held a permanent seat since CGR 3112, 3 years after the return, which is what history now calls the moment of the Persistence's arrival. It is the Cartographer Accords, the shared research framework that superseded the new Concordat Compact, and under which the technical knowledge of Project Cartographer was disclosed, in full, to every Concordat species, not distributed as a gift, but shared under a governance structure that humanity had spent 30 years designing before the return, and which the Council accepted within 18 months of the event. Because the alternative was attempting to negotiate with a species that had just demonstrated, it understood the galaxy's most devastating weapon better than its creators did. It is also, less triumphantly, the ruins of the Velmarie relay networks that were never fully rebuilt, and the Kethsaron colony worlds that stand at half their pre-severance population 4 centuries later, and the 8 species who are gone entirely, not one survivor, not one archive, not one voice, whose names we preserve in the Hall of Silences at the Orath Nexus Memorial, because to forget them would be to complete the Moor's work for them. The Moor themselves withdrew. That is the most accurate word for what happened, though some historians prefer retreated. The inversion of the severance in CGR 3109 did not destroy the Moor. Nothing in humanity's arsenal was designed to destroy, and that choice was deliberate. What it demonstrated was that the Moor's primary strategic asset was no longer asymmetric. They had built a galaxy-scale weapon on the assumption that understanding it was impossible for any species they would encounter. Humanity had disproved that assumption. The Moor, whatever they are rational. They recognized the new equation. They withdrew to a region of space approximately 400 light-years from the nearest Concordat system and have not been detected in offensive posture since. Whether they will remain there is a question this historian does not have the authority to answer, but I note that they have had 300 years to attempt another approach and have not done so. I note also that humanity spent those same 300 years doing what humanity always does, continuing the work. The Cartographer project was not disbanded after the return. It was expanded, declassified to Concordat partner status, and renamed the Coherence Institute. It now operates on 47 worlds, employs researchers from 22 species, and has, in the past century alone, produced advances in coherence field theory that have applications in medicine, communication, computation, and agricultural yield optimization that have materially improved the lives of more sentient beings than any single initiative in Concordat history. A weapon's understanding turned toward life. There is a lesson there that I will leave the listener to draw for themselves. Now, about what the galaxy got wrong. In the 4 centuries since the return, the question has been analyzed in more papers, seminars, historical retrospectives, and diplomatic postmortems than any other single question in recorded history. How did the Concordat fail to predict what humanity would do? How did every intelligence service, every analytical framework, every risk assessment model fail so completely? The answers usually focus on capability. No one thought humanity had the technological capacity, or on intent. No one thought humanity had sufficient motivation, or on time. No one thought humanity would sustain a covert project across multiple generations without a breach. These answers are not wrong, but they miss the fundamental error, which was not about capability or intent or operational security. The fundamental error was about what kind of thing humanity is. Every Concordat species that assessed humanity in CGR 2847 assessed them as a young species. By galactic standards, this was technically accurate. Humanity had been spacefaring for barely 4 centuries when the Moor struck, but the assessment carried an implicit assumption that young species means inexperienced species, and that inexperienced species means species that does not yet know how the galaxy works. The Concordat looked at humanity's short history and concluded that humans were still learning the rules. What they missed, what they catastrophically, completely, irreversibly missed, is that humanity had already been through everything the galaxy had to offer, on a single planet, in a single species history that spanned, in its pre-spaceflight period alone, approximately 300,000 years. Humanity had already invented war and survived it, had already built empires and watched them fall, had already developed and abandoned and redeveloped technologies across multiple cycles of collapse, had already learned the experience of being left behind, written off, and dismissed, not by alien species, but by each other. Every generation of humans for 300,000 years had grown up in a world that told some of them they did not matter, and had learned in the crucible of that experience something about persistence that no species growing up in a stable galactic civilization could quite understand. The Concordat looked at humanity and saw small fleet, limited reach, short individual lifespans, high internal conflict, recently spacefaring, and concluded, not a significant variable. What they should have seen, a species that had survived every extinction-level crisis it had ever faced, including several of its own making. A species whose defining characteristic, across every period of its history, was not any particular technology or social structure or cognitive ability, but a specific orientation toward problems. The refusal to accept that a problem was unsolvable simply because no solution currently existed. The Moor built the Severance on the assumption that coherence field disruption at scale was beyond the comprehension of any species it would encounter. For 4,000 years, that assumption was correct. Every species that faced the Severance accepted on some level that the weapon was beyond them. They defended, they shielded, they adapted to the new reality. None of them tried to understand it from first principles and build an answer. Humanity did not accept that it was beyond them. They received a fragment of the weapon and a young analyst's 3 words, "This is it," and they spent 261 years making the map. Not because they were smarter, not because they had better technology, because they had been told repeatedly throughout their history by forces much closer than the Moor that things were beyond them. And they had learned, not genetically, not through any biological imperative, but through the accumulated cultural sedimentation of 300,000 years of surviving exactly that the correct response to being told something is beyond you is to start working. Analyst Seth Vara saw something. She saw the pattern in the publications, the deliberate partial disclosure, the shape of a research program maintaining strategic opacity. She saw it and reported it and was told 4 times that her resources were better spent elsewhere. She was right and she was ignored, and that gap, between what was true and what was convenient to believe, is the gap through which 261 years of history flowed, unobserved. The lesson is not that intelligence agencies should be better funded, though they should. The lesson is not that bureaucracies should be more responsive to inconvenient analysis, though they should be. The lesson is this: the most dangerous error any civilization can make is to confuse its categories with reality. The Concordat had a category for humanity, Tier 3, provisional member, short-lived bipeds, high internal conflict, and that category was not entirely wrong, and it was completely inadequate. Because categories are static, and what they were looking at was not. I should tell you about this institution. The Galactic Remembrance Institute was founded in CGR 3201, 92 years after the return, by a coalition of 18 species with 2 explicit mandates: to preserve the historical record of every civilization in the Concordat, with particular emphasis on the civilizations lost in the Moor's discharge cycles, and to produce historical analysis that might, the founders used the word might, with appropriate epistemic humility, prevent comparable failures of understanding in the future. I am C.O. Vaughn. I am the current Grand Archivist of the Institute in the 4412th year of the post-convergence calendar. I am of the Orathi caste line that traces its descent in part to the administrative families of the old executive triad, the same families whose decisions, in CGR 2847, classified humanity as non-essential. I want you to know that. I want you to know that I carry that inheritance, and that I carry it as a scholar carries a weight they have chosen not to put down, because the weight is informative. Because the weight reminds me, every day, of what it costs to be wrong about what you are looking at. You who are listening to this account, you live in a galaxy that has been shaped by the events I have described as thoroughly as water is shaped by the rock it flows around. You live in a galaxy where 17 species hold executive seats in a governing body that enforces, not perfectly but genuinely, the principle that no civilization shall be classified as non-essential. You live in a galaxy where the Coherence Institute has produced, in the past 2 centuries, more advances in fundamental physics than the previous 2,000 years of Concordat research combined. You live in a galaxy that has not seen a more hostile action in 300 years. These are not coincidences. They are the downstream consequences of a choice made by a young analyst named Ren Vasquez-Eichta, who opened a data packet on a double shift and wrote 3 words because what he was looking at was too important to describe with more. They are the consequence of Dr. Yuki Tanaka Osai spending 44 years making a map. They are the consequence of families who gave their children to a project those children would not see completed. They are the consequence of S. Seth Vara filing a report 4 times and being ignored 4 times and filing it anyway, because she had seen something true, and truth does not become less true because it is inconvenient. And they are the consequence of what Admiral Kofi Asant-Mensah said on the morning of the day after the Moor's weapon inverted and the galaxy finally understood what humanity had done. He was standing in the council chamber. It was not a formal session. There were delegates present and press representatives, and what might be called the beginning of a very long celebration, and he was asked by a Keth Saron delegate, according to the record, a young woman who had been born after the return and who was seeing the Admiral for the first time, what humanity wanted now, what they were asking for, in return for what they had done. He looked at her for a moment, then he said, spoken by Admiral Kofi Asant-Mensah, T, in the new Concordat Council Chamber, CGR 3109, Day 3 post-return. From the official session transcript and corroborated by 6 independent witness accounts. We want a seat at the table, not because we earned it by doing this, because we were always supposed to have one. We were just waiting for you to be ready to see it. We were always supposed to have one. We were just waiting for you to be ready to see it. Sit with that. Consider what kind of people, what kind of civilization, what kind of deep and patient and undefeated sense of self produces a statement like that, not as defiance, not as anger, not as triumph, but as a simple statement of fact offered without heat at the end of 261 years. We were always supposed to have one. We were just waiting for you to be ready to see it. That is the history, that is what happened, that is the lesson. Go and do not forget it. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something, then hit that like button right now. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it today. Hit subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss another story like this one.